Hello and a warm welcome to Voice of Russia's Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Stepping away from the brink, Ukraine's announcement to restart work on an EU agreement after large street protests leaves the country and the government in sort of a limbo. President Viktor Yanukovych suggests an agreement could be signed in the spring if Europe can offer better financial conditions. To discuss this and much, much more, I'm joined by Roman Volchek. He's a research fellow at the University of Wolverhampton. We also have on the line in Kiev, we have Maxim Tucker. He is a Kiev-based freelance journalist writing for The Independent. And sitting here in Voice of Russia's Moscow studio with me is Mark Slobodka. He's a senior lecturer and researcher at Moscow State University. Maxim, since you're on the ground there, can you tell me essentially what's going on right now? Because we have Mr. Yanukovych again changing gears, changing direction, sending out different signals.
Absolutely. I mean, events last night and early this morning were a complete shock, I think, to everyone after Yanukovych had a discussion with three former presidents and Baroness Ashton yesterday, and he assured people that, in fact, he would be intending to sign the association agreement in March. That was quickly followed by police clampdown on the Euromaidan protests in the center of Kiev. Police forced their way through barricades and protested in an attempt to clear the square and destroy the infrastructure and the tents there. Doing that while Baroness Ashton is still actually visiting Kiev is an incredible snub, really, to the European Union. I don't think it sends a very good signal for future intentions of integration with Europe.
Okay, Mark, if I can go to you here in Moscow. I mean, Yanukovych made it very clear, if the European Union can offer better financial conditions, I'm not really sure what he's getting at there, because it's never been very much part of the association agreement at all, much money.
No, the association agreement is essentially a series of radical neoliberal shock therapy reforms that would do tremendous damage to the Ukrainian economy from the short to the medium term and very possibly into the long term if we see the poor success of other countries that have joined the European Union from Eastern Europe, such as Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, or the complete collapse of economics in Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, and so on, with the continued recession since 2008 in the EU. But Yanukovych has always intended to join the European Association Agreement. However, the terms that were presented in this 1,500-page neoliberal diktat in cooperation with the IMF, he has always been hoping to get better conditions.
Well, this is the whole thing. Roman, if I can go to you, I mean, this is what my first impression was in reading what Yanukovych had to say in the last few hours, because he's looking for a deal, and he's looking to Russia, he's looking to the European Union. We know that he was in China. He had a visit with Vladimir Putin in Sochi. He's out there wheeling and dealing as there's a protest in the center of the city. I mean, is this wise on his part? Does he have a master plan?
No, there's certainly very little evidence to suggest he has a master plan. His thinking is at best tactical, running from day to day. There is no evidence of a strategy. I mean, certainly a long-term strategy for Ukraine has been to balance east over west and west over east. And at the moment now that strategy is coming to an end because he is gradually being forced to make a choice. And finding himself that position, he's opted for the worst of both options, which is not choosing one or the other, but in fact leaving Ukraine in this limbo, and the effects are there for all to see.
Well, Maxine, if I can go to you on the phone, I suppose that gets to the crux of the whole thing, is that any party that wants to have it one way or the other, black and white, a binary decision, is always going to lose. We saw this during the Orange Revolution, that depending on your interpretation of its result, my interpretation, it failed. But now it seems like it's just a replay here. It seems this is not the right strategy, either or. It has to be both somehow. Maxime, go ahead.
I think that's correct. And I think there's a determination from people here now that they want to address the failings of the Orange Revolution, and they're not really supporting any particular opposition group. That they want to see increased respect for human rights, freedom of expression, assembly, and an end to these kind of police crackdowns.
Okay, well, I was a great observer of the Occupy Wall Street movement. I don't think that riot police differ very much around the world. Mark, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I would completely disagree with due respect Maxime characterization of the protesters and the rioters running rampant on the streets of Kiev. I have family in Kiev as well as in Simferopol and Donetsk right now, and they're terrified to leave their houses because of what's going on. Because you have, along with the normal perception of the protesters on the Maidan, you have thousands of Svoboda Party neo-Nazis, Bratstva, the Trizub, Stefan Bandera, the Nazi collaborator worshippers. And these are extremely violent protesters. They have been from the beginning. They attempted to crush police beneath a bulldozer. They were raining down petrol bombs and Molotov cocktails in what looked like an artillery barrage on December 1st. They have violently occupied several government buildings and set up that have now been taken down, thankfully, last night. They set up checkpoints and barricades on the streets and were flooding them with frozen ice water and creating a tremendous hazard and basically terror for many of the residents of downtown Kiev.
Roman, how representative are these protesters in Kiev of the Ukrainian people? Because as Mark pointed out, I lived in Poland for 10 years before I lived in Russia for the last 15 years. And my experience with Western Ukraine is it's very xenophobic, it's anti-Russian, it's homophobic, it's anti-Semitic. I mean, are these the people that are raising
human
their
rights?
Well, they are even contemptuous of human rights. I mean, is this being hijacked? I mean, to what degree is it representative? Because I know Eastern Ukraine very well. They are certainly not anti-Russian, and they don't look at it as a binary. I think everyone would like better human rights, better administration, better pensions. But why does it have to be an either-or decision? Go ahead, Roman.
The tirade of name calling and using labels allocated in a generic way. I mean, this is turning into a slightly surreal debate. I mean, what the debate to talk about people being terrified on the streets of Kiev. I also have extensive contacts of Kiev, and what the gentleman there just described does not resemble the version I've heard. So I think it's important to remember there are two sides to every story. The fact that there will always be some individuals who do have extreme views is not to be denied. That is to ignore the wider picture here, the bigger picture here. To suggest that the million or so people on the streets are all extremists is actually ridiculous.
No,
million?
There are
million?
people who are clearly articulating.
That's not what I was characterizing a population in Western Ukraine, and do the people that are protesting in Kiev on the Maidan reflect those views? That was what was pointed out. It's not characterizing the entire population of Kiev.
I don't want to be seen to be accepting the previous points which were made, which were patently surreal. Okay. I mean, they were a distorted version of events. I'm not saying that those kinds of things do not take place. I'm merely saying they are not representative of the voice which is being heard on the Maidan. Because if you listen to the various channels which are being heard, there is a very recent debate about a pro-European orientation, because it's much more than what the previous speaker referred to as a neoliberal diktat. It is actually people expressing a preference to be aligned to an organization, i.e. the European Union, which is rule-based and compliance-based, which is not subject to the whims of the individual who happens to be in power at any time. It's something about young people increasingly travel from Ukraine to the West, and they see the way the systems work in the West, and they go back home and they see the authoritarian regime, the economic costs which are being borne by them as you get cronyism in Ukraine. And so what they're expressing a dissatisfaction with the regime in Ukraine and a preference for the regimes which exist in Western Europe. And despite the fact
let me ask other members on the panel, please. Does that call for the overthrow of the constitutional order in Kiev? Mark, would you like to field that?
Well, of course not. We have a democratically elected government in the Ukraine, which just a few weeks ago, as the European Union was willing to do business with, as long as it signed their association agreement and entered into the European Union's geopolitical orbit. But when they backed out, seemingly simply because of the atrocious economic conditionality that was attached to it, reminiscent of the Washington Consensus across Africa and the developed world, the European Union responds with petulance and indignation, sending European Union government officials in a flagrant violation of the Ukraine's sovereignty to agitate the crowds that are openly calling for forcible revolution on the streets of Kiev. I really can't imagine how this is any reflection of the sovereignty that the Ukraine would face and what is well known as a democracy deficit European Union.
Okay, gentlemen, I have to jump in here. You're listening to Voice of Russia's political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Maxime, if I can go back to you, I mean, what kind of cards does Yanukovych hold right now? Because he obviously wants to placate the protester to some degree. Maybe he'll hope they'll just go away. He's saying in the spring. That's obviously months away from now. And he's talked about closer relations with Russia. Again, I guess one of the things that I don't understand in looking at all of this is where is the compromise? Because it always seems that with the European Union, either it's our way or the highway. You have to do things our way. Why? Because we're superior to you.
I think that the European Union has to set for its own credibility and to continue at democratic standards within the bloc, has to set that kind of a standard which aspiring states adhere to, and it's really up to the states to choose that. I think the reason the EU is now putting pressure on Ukraine is because actually the people have voiced their desire to become eventually part of the EU. And that's a genuine protest that we're seeing here on the streets of Kiev, and to characterize it as a completely far-right movement is rather hysterical and hilarious. I think what's happened here is that, yes, Yanukovych was genuinely, more or less, elected in 2010, but on the basis that he would move Ukraine towards a European future, and he's now broken that social contract with the people, and the people are expressing their dissatisfaction with that.
All right, Mark.
Well, which people are you talking about? Because the Ukraine is completely divided east from west. The Kiev International Institute of Sociology just this month released their poll showing that the Ukrainian population is split 38-30%, almost exactly on geographic lines, between a Russian-speaking Russian ethnic east, which is against signing this European Association Agreement. Certainly, if it would detail separation from the customs union, which is the vast majority of the Ukraine's trade. Excuse me?
It's not the vast majority. 35% of Ukraine's trade is with the European Union.
It's 60%. Yeah, yes. Russia's trade. Russia is the Ukraine's biggest single trade partner. In fact, last year, Russia's trade with the Ukraine was bigger than the entirety of the trade of the Ukraine with every country in the European Union. And as of last year, the Ukraine's trade with the customs union was 60% of the Ukraine's trade. So any abrogation of the Commonwealth of Independent States free trade agreement.
Mark, Roman in London, go ahead. You can let's go to Roman next, please.
I would concur with some of the previous points which were made that the EU has made some poor decisions as regards its relations with the Ukraine. I mean, certainly it failed to take into account the costs which Ukraine would incur by not joining the by the customs union. Also, the punitive measures imposed by Russia, and correspondingly, it's failed to offer Ukraine much of a package. So I do believe that Mr. Yanukovych did find himself in a very difficult position. Having said that, again, I'd have to disagree with Mr. Sloboda's earlier comments that in the long term, the evidence shows that Ukraine actually would benefit noticeably by joining the European Union with a GDP growth in excess of 4 to 6% over a period of time.
What evidence is that? Because if we take a look at Bulgaria, where people are burning themselves alive, 6 people last year because of the economic conditions. Romania, where polls show that people say that their social economic needs were better met under Ceausescu. Greece, Italy, Portugal. I mean, let's face it, the Europeans' convergence machine is badly broken.
Roman, please, I'd like to go to Maxime on the phone. Yeah. Maxime, this gets down to the. Can I phrase it? I'd like to phrase kind of the discussion that we've been having here. It seems to me this is broken up into 2 parts here, and it's very real perceptions and legitimate for people in Ukraine. I mean, obviously there are people looking to the European Union because they believe that they will have a higher life standard of living and better quality of life. But we know that Ukraine is in horrible economic situation. It's one of the reasons why this is turning into a crisis. And then also it's the values thing, because Europe has certain values that it believes it is important, even superior. And this is what spooks a lot of people in eastern Ukraine. So it seems to me that it's trying to make the sovereign Ukraine, all people swallow a whole lot at the same time. Go ahead, Maxime.
Well, I think that's one of the very interesting things about what we're seeing here in Kiev is that what was originally a completely kind of EU-focused protest movement, which was perhaps about to die out, has changed into something quite radically different after the police quite brutally cracked down on hundreds of students who were staying the night on Maidan. And it's now become, a lot less about East and West and more about the freedom to express yourself, the right to freedom of assembly, and to prevent Ukraine sliding into the kind of authoritarian state that you see in Russia. Not only in Kiev, but around Ukraine as well, there are thousands of people who are taking to the streets to protest against what the government has done. And if you look around at some of the cars parked on Rushatik and in Maidan, you can see many number plates from kind of Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk, which indicate, there's actually a much broader support for the current protest than there was for the original pro-European protests.
Okay, Mark. So it seems to me that, instead of casting aspersions on Russia's very stable political order, popular order, I would even say by public opinion polls, you have a whole stream of of European Union officials coming in saying what the Ukrainian people should do. I mean, let me give you an example, Mark. What if Vladimir Putin or Dmitry Medvedev or Mr. Zhirinovsky, they went to Scotland and pushed for independence of Scotland? How would that be perceived?
I've got a better one for you, Peter.
All right.
Moldova just recently initialed a beginning version of what the Ukraine was supposed to sign this year, despite the fact that the polls show that the majority of the Moldavian people were against signing the EU Association Agreement and in favor of joining the customs union. Now, what if Russian politicians went to the crowds that were protesting against the association agreement in Chechnya and spoke to crowds that were crawling for revolution in Moldavia, or better yet, for the non-citizens that are in Lithuania or Latvia? They would be calling Russia a revisionist, expansionist state that was bullying its neighbors and reacting petulantly because its imperial demands weren't met by neighboring countries. This is exactly what the European Union officials, including the sitting vice president of the European Parliament, have been doing, agitating to crowds, openly calling for forcible revolution and the overthrow of a democratically elected government in the Ukraine. It boggles the mind, really.
Well, Robin, do you think the European Union has overplayed its hand here?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. On the one hand, it has certainly, the visits, are demonstrating solidarity with the supporters. But I think the extent to which demonstrating solidarity with supporters, in the sense that they do not want them to be attacked, is not to be underestimated. There are real concerns about that, and we've seen what's happened already. So the European Union is particularly keen to be seen to be doing that. But as regards the point of Russians going to Scotland and proclaiming independence, Russia has in effect already sought to undermine Ukraine. It's tried to torpedo the agreement from a very early stage. The Russian retaliatory measures are hardly the
well, Roman. One of the interesting things in all of this, is that the European Union always has its geopolitical interests, and people recognize that. But anytime anyone that doesn't agree with the European Union, well, they don't have legitimate interests. Mark, what are Russia's legitimate interests when it comes to Ukraine?
Well, first of all, we have a shared history and culture with much of the Ukraine. Second of all, they're one of Russia's largest trade partners. Russia has been a sister country with the Ukraine. In fact, you could say that Russia itself modern Russia is a colony of Kievan Rus. So there is a great deal of shared culture, language values, with 75% of the Ukrainian population speaking Russian on a daily basis at home.
Maxime, as we go down this, it continues to be a crisis. I was in Kiev during the Orange Revolution, and after all those elections afterwards, I gave up because they had so many of them at one point. How does Ukraine mend itself, or is it just going to continue down this path it seems to me that if you get, and I'm not saying everyone in Maidan is a lunatic or a fascist, I'm not saying that, but you certainly hear and see things that are quite scary, considering it's the European Union that wants this country closer to them. I mean, how do we keep Ukraine together? Because at a certain point, if it is pushed too hard, we could see Ukrainians' sovereignty endangered.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's why leadership is such an important issue for Ukraine at the moment. And I think President Yanukovych and his government have now completely lost any credibility as leadership. Not only in Western Ukraine, but in Kiev and parts of Eastern Ukraine as well, who have been noticeably silent in kind of support for Yanukovych and his government. And so I think what it's time to see is a change in leadership. The difficulty is to see where that comes from, because the opposition there's no real strong characters. A lot of them were involved in the failures of the Orange Revolution in 2004. But perhaps Vitaly Klitschko, as a newcomer who is a native Russian speaker with links to Russia, but also making an effort to speak Ukrainian, engage with those people, perhaps he has a chance of bringing the two parts of the country together, which is desperately needed. So if snap elections were called, then that might be a way forward for Ukraine.
Mark, I think that Maxim brings up a really good point. Let's talk about Yanukovych's power base. It's in the East. It's the party of the regions. They pushed very hard for this European Association Agreement. Where do we go now? Because it seems that Yanukovych doesn't really know what to do.
Yeah, I think this is the one thing that I have in complete agreement with our reporter on the ground, is that there is a deficit of leadership across the board in the Ukraine. Yanukovych has effectively, in the minds of most of his supporters and the Party of Regions as a whole, largely as a collection of Donbass oligarchs, has completely betrayed his own constituency in the East and South, which are very much against any kind of separation from Russia or the exact terms of this EU association agreement. And they really have been politically neutered, I think, by Yanukovych's lobbying for this association agreement over the last 6 to 8 months. At the same time, on the other side, you see, we have three big opposition party leaders on the stage. One of them is Svoboda, which even in the Western press prior to these events was characterized as a neo-Nazi party. And to see European Union and American officials on the stage with them when they are homophobic, anti-Semitic, openly racist and anti-Russian, and actually their stance is against joining the EU, which no one talks about in the Western press. How many of the protesters out there are not protesting in favor of the EU? They're actually protesting simply against the government and against Russia. And Klitschko, this is a man who is a taxpayer and a tax resident in Germany. And the German Angela Merkel, she has openly announced that she will campaign in the Ukraine for this German tax-paying tax resident for the president of the Ukraine, a former boxer. It shows leadership deficit across the board in the Ukraine.
Roman, how would you want to weigh in there? We have to remind our listeners there are some very large debts to be paid in the first quarter of next year. They're looming, and we're talking billions and billions of dollars.
I would suggest that the quality of this debate reflects exactly the kind of reasons why Ukraine is, and the people on the streets are expressing their desire to move the European Union. The name calling, the slurs which have been imposed by Mark Sloboda, the misrepresentation of facts is kind of something that the Ukrainians on the ground are kind of used to, and they're getting a little bit fed
Roman,
up of.
If you want to make those claims,
well, excuse
me, sir. If you want to say that, you want to cast aspersions on someone's opinion or person, I'll give you a minute to give an example of where you're a better fact checker. Go ahead, please.
No, I'm not going to do that. I mean, I could do. I mean, if you're going to start statistics about the vast majority of people in the eastern and southern Ukraine are for the customs union against the European Union, those statistics are not actually incorrect. The numbers of people in pro-European in eastern and southern Ukraine are actually 30 to 40%. The other statistic I would suggest is when there was a deficit, when there was no political view to sign the customs union, you did not see people coming onto the streets anywhere, not even in the heart heartlands of Mr. Yanukovych. As soon as he didn't sign the association agreement, you see masses of people on the streets. So you don't need a statistician to tell you there is strong support for one geopolitical preference over another. There's a statistic or a fact which speaks for itself. But so when we're neglecting the fact that there is no strong support for the customs union, which your Mr. Sloboda seems to be inferring.
I'm sorry, the Kiev International Institute of Sociology stated that 38% shows polls showing 38% of the Ukrainian population is in favor of joining the customs union, and 38% is in favor of the EU association agreement. There were 70,000 people on the streets of Kharkiv last week, completely unreported by the Western press, which presents a completely one-sided and a fairly fetishist presentation of these protesters.
Okay, I'd like to go to Maxime Tucker on the phone here. Maxime, one of the things I hope I won't get Roman upset with this, but I look at some of the rhetoric coming out of both sides, the government, the opposition, and some European Union officials, which I find really dispiriting, calling it in being in solidarity. But as I said in my previous question, is that this country is going to hit a brick wall pretty soon and pretty hard. Everyone's fighting over the seating order on the Titanic right now.
I do wish to emphasize the fact that I think now for many Ukrainians that you speak to, the debate has actually gone beyond whether this is about EU membership, but it's about the credibility of the government and the people's reaction to an extremely violent crackdown on the 30th of November and again on the 1st of December. People are really saying that what they want is that this government to get out and for there to be fair elections. And if there are fair elections, then Mr. Yanukovych and his government have as much support as Mr. Sloboda thinks they do, then there really shouldn't be a problem for them. But their absolute incredible reluctance to hold any elections really, I think, demonstrates how
I'm sorry, but Maxime, they did have elections. Can't we wait to the next election cycle? And if they win, or if they run, they lose. Mark, go ahead. I mean, it has to be. If you don't like the regime, they have to have an election. Well, I don't like Barack Obama, but we're not going to have an election in the United States.
This complete attempt in the Western press to speak of and for the Ukrainian people as if the protesters out there in the Maidan represent the entirety of the people of the Ukraine. First of all, to characterize these protests as 1 million people, as some of the opposition themselves, leaders of Ukraine, even in the Western press, has been downplayed. There's really no way that more than 100,000 people can fit on that square, and that's what most of the serious estimates of this crowd have been. During the week, these crowds fall to about 5,000, as Reuters and the AP have reported, sometimes several hundred over the night. And most of these people, as interviews on the ground have shown, as reported by several independent Ukrainian newspapers, are from the Western Ukraine. They're not from Kiev. So there is no doubt that there is a lot of strong feeling in the Western Ukraine that Kiev is divided and that the East is pro-Russian.
Maxime, I'll give you the last word on the program. Go ahead.
I think that, any good reporter on the ground makes it a genuine effort to get out there and speak to as many people as they can. And also, there are various different opinion surveys and polls that you could look at, some of which put support for the European Union at 45%. And it's true that there are many disparate groups within the opposition. But I think there is one thing that is uniting them all, and that is the desire to see this government gone.
All right, gentlemen, we've run out of time. Very spirited debate. I want to thank Roman Volchek, Maxime Tucker, and Mark Sloboda here. I'm Peter Lavelle. You've been listening to Voice of Russia's Debating Russia. Stay with VOR.